Today we're going to be talking about phospholipids and fatty acids. We're going to concentrate specifically on fatty acids. A phospholipid consists of a glycerol molecule, and attached to it is two fatty acids and a phosphate group. The fatty acids can come in two varieties, so let's go ahead and write that down. Fatty acids, Fa, can come in two varieties, saturated and unsaturated. Saturated fatty acids have only single bonds between the carbon atoms, and unsaturated fatty acids have double bonds somewhere between the carbon atoms. So it looks like this. Saturated fatty acids, you see a carbon, single bond, carbon. Unsaturated fatty acids, carbon, double bond, two covalent bonds, and a carbon atom. So let's go ahead and actually draw some fatty acids and show you a little bit more what we're talking about. Let's start with unsaturated or saturated fatty acids. So here's the saturated fatty acid. We're going to start by drawing a carboxyl group, a C double bond OH, attached to carbon, 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 etc. And off the carbons are going to be hydrogens. This is a saturated fatty acid because it only has single bonds between the carbon atoms. And each carbon atom is holding the maximum number of hydrogens. So the carbons are saturated with hydrogens. Unsaturated fatty acids look like this. Carbon, double bond oxygen, OH, so there's our carboxyl group. And here's our carbons. Etc. We'll put our hydrogens on the carbons. And here is a double bond. This is an area of unsaturation. And you can see that these two carbons are not holding the maximum number of hydrogens that they possibly could. So we say that this type of fatty acid is unsaturated. Notice also that the double bond introduces a kink into this fatty acid. The fatty acid tail actually bends. Instead of going straight, it actually bends. That's going to be very, very important. Let's go ahead and draw the shorthand structures for these types of fatty acids. We'll start with the saturated fatty acid. A saturated fatty acid looks like this. There's the phosphate head. And here, this is a phospholipid. Here's the phosphate head, and here's the fatty acid tails. Notice the fatty acid tails, although they zigzag back and forth a bit, overall, they tend to look straight. And because of that, you can fit lots of these phospholipids very close to each other. They pack in very tightly. And because of that, the fluidity is kind of poor. This would make a rigid cell membrane because there's very little room for these phospholipids to move around or to wiggle. Let's take a look at an unsaturated fatty acid. It's going to look like this. Here's the phosphate head, and by the way, this is a phospholipid again. And here's the fatty acid tails. Notice the kink here. Here's the kink, and there's the kink. And notice how the fatty acid tails actually move away from each other. And I'll draw a few more. Notice because of the unsaturation here, these phospholipids do not pack as tightly as these saturated ones do. Because of that, these phospholipids have more wiggle room. They're able to move back and forth more. And due to that, this membrane would have more fluidity. It would be more flexible. Now, an animal's or a plant cell membrane can actually regulate itself by varying the degree of saturation and unsaturation, depending upon the circumstances. Now, unsaturated phospholipids come in two varieties. So let's go ahead and we'll write that right here. The two varieties are cis and trans. Cis fatty acids have the hydrogens on the same side of the double bond, and trans fatty acids have the hydrogens on opposite sides of the double bond. So cis means the same side, and trans is going to mean opposite side, or opposite sides. This is going to be very important. It turns out that our bodies like cis unsaturated fatty acids much better than trans. Cis unsaturated fatty acids actually increase our health, where trans fatty acids actually increase the risk of heart disease and cancers. These are often produced by high heat, by corporations, by factories, adding high heat to fats to prolong the shelf life of their products. So, fats are going to make a big difference in cells and in your health.